In order to understand contracts in English law, it is important to understand the difference between unilateral contracts and bilateral contracts. Unilateral contracts involve one party taking on an obligation. In other words, in unilateral contracts, only one person or one party has an obligation to do something. But with bilateral contracts, two parties have an obligation to do something under the agreement reached. Let's have a look at unilateral contracts first. A classic example of a unilateral contract is the type of contract that an estate agent normally enters into with a person who is attempting to sell their property. These agreements normally state that if the estate agent happens to sell the property in question, the owner of the property has an obligation to give the estate agent a particular percentage of the sale price. But this is a unilateral contract, and it is a unilateral contract because the estate agent does not say, I must sell your property. The estate agent says, if I sell your property, he is not under an obligation to sell your property. But if he does, you, the homeowner or the home seller, you are under an obligation. You are under an obligation to give the estate agent a percentage of the sale price if he sells the property. Now, when we turn to bilateral contracts, we see that with these contracts, not just one party has an obligation, as with the estate agent and the seller of the property, but both parties have an obligation. Both parties have something that they must do as agreed to under the contract in question. As an example, let's remind ourselves of the agreement that was reached between Keith's Kitchens and Jane and Mark in lecture 1 of this course. Under that agreement, both parties were under an obligation. Let's call Jane and Mark Party A, and let's call Keith's Kitchens Party B. Party A, Jane and Mark, was under an obligation to pay £3,000 to Party B, Keith's Kitchens. There was no if in that agreement, was there? No, both parties had to do something. Party A was to pay the money, and Party B was to get the job done. So this is an example of a bilateral contract. Now, most contracts that we enter into are bilateral contracts, but unilateral contracts are also important. And to sum up, let's remind ourselves that a bilateral contract is a contract which puts both parties of the contract under an obligation, and a unilateral contract is a contract that puts only one party under an obligation.